Hello guys, and welcome to the second episode. Today I'm gonna talk about my role-playing game past, about my history in role-playing games, what I've been playing, what I've liked, what have been my experiences in some of these games, and what I'm looking at currently, what I'm playing currently, and a bit about my experience all around. I started playing role-playing games around 1985 or 86. It's been quite a while, so I don't actually remember the exact year so well. But what I remember is that the first game I ever got into was actually Dungeons and Dragons, D&D, like so many others. But my experience with D&D was quite short-lived, and it didn't take a long time for me to get into different games, which I enjoyed a lot more. It happened in this way that I met a friend of mine in school, and he introduced me to a friend of his, who I think was maybe in the class 1 year above us, and said that he was organizing a role-playing game at his house. I had no idea what it was. I had never before played or heard that much about role-playing games, but I was intrigued, so I went with my friend to this other guy's house, and we spent an afternoon after school playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that was actually the red D&D box set, and I was instantly in love with the idea of rolling dice, creating your character, and having these adventures in different dungeons in different worlds, and traveling around and of course slaying monsters and so on. But as we played for a few times, I soon realized maybe D&D was not the game that I was looking for. I was not really that enthusiastic about the rules, how they functioned, what were the character classes, and what were the different restrictions on your choices in having a character class, the combat mechanics, spell mechanics, and also maybe the D&D world altogether seemed a bit strange after being accustomed to kind of Tolkien-esque worlds and a bit different type of idea of fantasy. I think also one factor in not liking D&D that much was maybe also the personality of the guy who was running the game. He was an okay guy, but we were all kids, and then at that age it's a lot easier to come to maybe a negative idea of another person and then think about moving off in a different direction. So we played maybe a couple of games, and then I was interested in role-playing games, and I'd been told that there's a guy who really lived next to school and was also selling role-playing games from his house, because at that point there were no stores selling role-playing games in the city, and also none of the bookstores yet had an idea what role-playing games were and did not really stock any games. So one day, me and a friend of mine went to pay this guy a visit. He was starting a business of selling role-playing games from his house with a friend of his, and basically he was storing all the games in his house, and at that point still selling directly from there. So stepping into that house and seeing a lot of different games at that time frame, there was a lot of early role-playing games like Paranoia, D&D, I think Bushido was one of them, Twilight 2000, those types of games. And I think one of the games that really caught my eye back then, or Game Worlds, was actually Harn, where I saw the Harn box set, and I think I saw the Ivinia box set on sale. And I was just looking at the maps and wondering how great they looked at the time. Then that was maybe the first experience with role-playing games, but I really got heavily into them after a trip to the United States where I went with my mom. And there, as I discovered that different role-playing games were for sale in bookstores, I quickly spent all of my allowance of my money by buying the Middle-earth role-playing game, or MERP, box set and all the different modules that I could find that were on sale at the time. And that was quite a lot, and I do remember my mom wondering what on earth is she gonna do with all of these. And this was really the era when parents did not understand role-playing games. The kind of satanic panic was still coming and did not really hit the people's consciousness that okay, role-playing games are something bad. So that time hadn't really appeared yet here. When I came back, I started reading these games, and like I was still a kid at that point, trying to learn English to the best of my ability. I had often a lot of difficulties in understanding what they were about, but since the game was about Middle-earth, and I was really familiar with Tolkien's works, having read Lord of the Rings a few times already, then I found it easy to grasp at least some of the basics and to understand what the game's races were about, to understand about the professions, and of course a lot of the background of Middle-earth. Then we started playing with a couple of friends. I think there were like 3 to 5 friends involved, and we would try out the game, create characters, and I remember that those early games were just all over the place, really trying out every possible thing and not really understanding the rules completely, so we were just winging it at points, just playing for the fun of it and try to have the best possible experience. Of course, being kids, we did have arguments over the rules points, over the course of the adventure, what was happening in the adventure, and whether it was cool to do things this way or that way, or and so on, and how much experience the character should gain per adventure and so on. That phase continued for a while. I remember that we would play in friends' homes, sometimes at the local youth hall, and have different guys come in and play from our group of friends. Then MERP, the Middle-earth role-playing game, started showing maybe some limitations, because we saw that in the modules, in the campaigns, there were lots of characters statted out actually with Rolemaster rules, which was like the more advanced version of the rules that MERP was using. So it was time to step up and go into Rolemaster. And Rolemaster, as the people who are familiar with and know it, is like the chart master or the table master, where you can spend a lot of time just rolling on different tables, especially during combat, where you're trying to hit somebody and roll for critical hits, and you would just get the most amazing results, just crazy stuff happening to your enemies if you're rolling E-crits or D-crits or whatever was the maximum critical ability at the time. So that then gave a lot of more variety and choice to our games. The characters were more complex, not just, I think, about thinking about the stats and different spells and possibilities and leveling up, but also as to what type of motivation they would have and what was their role in the game and in the game world. We played Middle-earth, I think, for a few years, but I think all this time I was also looking at different other games, different other opportunities for gaming, and a lot of things about world creation. I wasn't doing a lot of world building at that point. Of course, I had some homebrew stuff that I have been doing, but I never felt that that would match something like the variety and depth of Middle-earth. And I was of course looking for different inspirations from different sources like books and comics and movies all the time, and trying to see what would be something cool to have in these games. And as I mentioned, Harn was one of the early points where I looked at world building on a really in-depth scale. For those who don't know, Harn is a world designed by Andrew Crosby, but it also has its own game system called Harn Master. But back then, Harn was kind of a standalone system agnostic game world where the Harn box set had been published, and there was coming a steady stream of different kingdoms, different castles, keeps, information on the religion, towns, and adventure locations. Harn is what you could call a simulationist game, so it tries to simulate kind of a fantasy version of early Middle Age Britain, which has been kind of skewed and transformed into a adventure location where they have stuffed not only separate different kingdoms into Harn, but also a mass of barbarian tribes, groups of orcs living in their dungeons, the creations of a mystical god which spring up from one area in Harn where this god is supposed to dwell, and lots of stuff that normally you wouldn't think, okay, I want to create a version of Britain and put everything there. But Harn has been and really is, I think, still unmatched in detail and the level of simulation that it offers. You can look at the Harn map, the early map itself, and that already is a map which is hard to beat when you look at the level of detail and the craft that has been put into the map. And that's just the early map done 1984, 1985, and it still stands the test of time. I've seen a lot of maps from different game lines, and if they are not really looking for the kind of OSR type design or affinity, but are trying to be more modern, they still don't match the Harn map which was made in 1985. And this not even talking about the later maps made by Celestia Productions, which have taken the Harn map and updated it so you can get a layered PDF map which looks basically like a satellite image of what is happening. Of course, it's a matter of taste whether that's for you or you like a more traditional type of map, but I think those are like the gold standards of map mapping to me in role-playing games. So Harn has been famous for its, I think, the regional map and way you start looking at it and think about what kind of opportunities that can give you, and then when you dig deeper and you drill down to a kingdom, you can have all the information about the different keeps of the kingdom. For every keep or castle, all the settlements are listed. You can know exactly how many people are living there, who is holding that settlement, where it's located, and basically what is being produced there, how many men-at-arms or knights it will supply to the liege lord, and so on. So really unmatched detail. So after having played for a time in Middle-earth, we then started going towards Harn, and I remember that we were using Rolemaster rules for Harn also because we were already pretty familiar with them. So our next adventures would be just going around Harn, the different areas there, and just wreaking havoc in every possible place on Harn. And I think the players went to a lot of the different kingdoms, a lot of the adventure sites, traveled to Godstones, also visited places in Ivinia, and sailed around Harn quite a bit. Then I think as we were looking at other options for gaming, also the Handmaster had come out. I looked at it, at the Handmaster rules, and they of course are really famous for their simulationist approach, super deadly combat, a lot of detail on how characters are created, also fair amount of mathematics involved in the character creation, and I found it actually pretty difficult to grasp the overall combat mechanic and especially the damage mechanic. Okay, I must confess that I really didn't read it with the level of detail that I should have, and if I had spent a bit more time, then it would have been a bit easier to grasp. But Rolemaster was the system that we had gotten used to, so that's what we continue with. But as we played in Harn, I think my interest game related to games mechanics was drifting a bit towards other directions. So briefly we looked at Fantasy Hero as an alternative for Rolemaster. We did play a few things with Fantasy Hero on Harn and also in a place called Shouju, which is located in the same world as Harn, but really on the different side of the continent of Lithia, this being kind of Japan analog in the Harn world. But that did not take a long time. I remember that my problems with Fantasy World was maybe that, Fantasy Hero was that the rules did not offer the kind of detail that I would have wanted to implement on Harn, and also things like the martial arts rules were there, so that was perfect for kind of oriental adventures at that point. But if you wanted to use spells, Fantasy Hero had its spells, but they really did not have the flavor of the magic that Harn had. Harn has special flavor to its magic, even though it's kind of elemental 6 magic type division of traditions, but still the flavor and types of spells are quite distinct. Then we were also looking at different other options. I remember that at times we also played Space Master, which was the space kind of sibling of Rolemaster, the space version to its fantasy, but Space Master never had the draw of having the level of detail and imagination that I think we can see in Traveller, which I looked at the time but really did not get into, to the point that I would have brought the rules. I remember that I have had a couple of Traveller supplements already at that point, and I was just amazed at the level of detail and the amount of work that had been put into creating the whole galaxy and mapping out all the sectors at the point, which to me was super impressive and still is. So Traveller was one of the games that I looked at. I remember that also Top Secret at some point was something that I bought. I think we never played it, but it was just something that I like to look at and think, okay, maybe it would be cool to run a campaign on this, but we never really got to the point. After playing these fantasy games for a while, I think in the early 90s was the time when I discovered Vampire the Masquerade, and then that would be the next kind of leading idea, the leading light for many years to come. To me, Vampire the Masquerade really hit in a stage when a lot of the ideas and the kind of zeitgeist of the time was moving in the same direction. So you had the music, you had a lot of the films, you had a lot of the imagery present in media, and Vampire the Masquerade just hit on the correct time. I remember that when I read it, I was impressed by the fact that they managed to make vampires into these playable characters and had these cool disciplines, had different types of mechanics, which I hadn't seen before. Also, willpower was something a bit different than I had seen before mechanically. I think there was it took some time to convince the players to try it out because they weren't super excited about the idea of playing vampires and were wondering what kind of things they should do. This was also the era when this type of urban fantasy was not really prevalent at the time. So there was of course Sandman. I remember, I think Invisibles was making an impact, maybe later than that, but some things were happening at this point. Then we got into Vampire and really played everything possible with the first set of rules and Chicago by Night and the different adventures which were available at the beginning. I remember when Werewolf came out, I bought it, I looked at it, and I used it a couple of times in different scenarios for Vampire, but mostly we used werewolves, had bad guys, and I think nobody was super interested in playing werewolf. We played Vampire for a long time, and with different groups of people. So there were a couple of guys who were always staying in the group, but then we had sometimes people coming in, leaving, trying it out, or we would go to some different place to play with somebody's friends, and we had a lot of different experiences with different people with Vampire. We would go on to play the second edition, and then I remember that I bought Vampire the Dark Ages at one point. I was really interested in seeing what would be the kind of past version of Vampire, what they had created, what kind of storylines they had created, and what was really the path of the Camarilla and its creation. And that inspired me to do a kind of ancient world vampire campaign. So I started a campaign set in ancient Egypt, and the idea was actually to play from Egypt to Rome, from Rome to Middle Ages, from Middle Ages to the Viking era, and so on, and then try to approach the timeline of the Giovanni Chronicles, play through that, and then come finally to something resembling modern age. Of course, that was a too ambitious project for me, but we managed to play throughout Egypt quite a lot, and actually arrived at, I think, through Greece to the Roman era, where we stopped playing Vampire, this Dark Ages version, around the Punic Wars, which would have heated up then between the Bruja-led Carthage and Ventru-led Rome. Of course, lots of different clans were involved, and it was really fun time, lots of Methuselah type characters flying around and just killing different vampires. Of course, it was not only about super powerful vampires killing each other, there were elements of personal horror and degradation of humanity involved. But I think what has been kind of revelation to me is the fact that, of course, if you give your players the possibility of playing these superpowered vampires with cool skills, of course they want to use it, and that's what the game will slowly move towards. So even if you want to play a game of personal horror, if you are giving different options for them, of course they will play the kind of things they feel like playing. Then I think we were quite far in this campaign in the Roman era when Vampire the Requiem came out, and of course I liked these ideas in the Requiem because a lot of the material in Vampire the Masquerade had come pretty dated, and the quality of, for example, the first edition Vampires Black books was really all over the place. Some of them being good, some of them being just horrible, and a lot of lore had accrued over time. And of course, Vampire has had and has still its meta plot, and I could feel kind of creator sense of ownership and favoring certain types of NPCs in this meta plot. So it would take away from the player agency and their ability to do things. Then Requiem kind of cleaned the table and set out another vampire world with different options and different ideas for the clans to do, and that's something that we started, I think, with a bit different group of players going in, and we played that for quite a while. The plot line for the campaign was that the player characters were actually a group of motorcycle gang members who all had been turned into vampires at the same time and then left to die in a burning building. And they managed to break out and then started looking around and discovering what the world of vampires was about, and had to, of course, the players had to deal with the reality that now the world of Vampire Requiem is not the same as Vampire the Masquerade, and there are significant changes as to what the vampires were about. This campaign went along for quite a while, a couple of years at least, and then I think the group of players had become a bit established in the sense that there were not many visitors coming in, the same persons were playing, and I think we played Requiem till around 2005, maybe 2006, but then as we got older, more mature, also the players started having kids, and I think when the first player had a son and then dropped out of gaming, then second player had a son, got out of gaming, and then also my firstborn was born. Then it became too difficult to organize gaming sessions. Nobody had really the time anymore to do that, and we really focused on the family life. So that meant a longish break in my gaming. So by that time I had been playing roughly about 21 years straight, with some breaks in between, and then this meant actually a break of roughly 7 years, at which time I might have been reading some role-playing related things at some times, but not really focusing in games that much. So time passed, and as I was dabbling in other things, in other hobbies and reading, I still felt at times kind of burned for coming back to role-playing games and getting back to gaming and having this social experience with my friends. And at one point I started looking around. I think I had been reading some web forums about role-playing games, and I started looking around the web, that what was the current situation with role-playing games, what was the new hotness, what was going on, and I checked out what was happening with Vampire, but also with other different games. And then I actually stumbled upon the current situation with Harn World and what was happening with it. So as we had left Harn maybe back in 88, 89, thereabouts, that was a time when the third regional module called Shorkine had come out, which was one big piece in the Harn puzzle. Then I discovered that, okay, now it's been a long time that I have really seen anything. I learned that Coleman Games, which was publishing Harn and Harn World, had actually split with N. Robin Crosby, the creator of Harn, with whom they have had a joint copyright of Harn. So Henry Crosby had set up Celestia Productions to continue producing Harn material, but as he had not come to an agreement with Columbia Games was still publishing their own Harn material. So I discovered that Celestia Productions had actually produced a whole slew of new material that I had never read and really expanded greatly on Harn. So that really inspired me to go out and check what they had done. I bought everything that I could get my hands on quite quickly. It was only in electronic format because they had and still are not producing anything physical, only electronic. So I would buy all the PDFs and read through all of the material. And that was really, to me, super inspiring, because if you can imagine that you had played in Middle-earth, for example, only based on things that were available in The Hobbit, and suddenly you are given the width and detail of Lord of the Rings. So that was not maybe the equivalent, but a bit resembling the situation with Harn, because Harn by that time and still has been really done to the level of detail that I think not a lot of more details necessary. Of course, you can describe all the different keeps that have not yet been described, and a whole lot already have and provide a huge amount of detail. But then there's the the rest of the world to explore. And Celestia Productions had set out to do this, and that really inspired me to go out and get back into role playing. So I read a lot of the material that they had produced and suggested to my friend that okay, maybe it's time to get back into role playing. And this was then around 2016, no, 2014, around the time my firstborn was 7 years old. So the kids were at this point getting into school, needed a bit less supervision, and now it was possible to get a free time slot in some weekends to play a bit. So we would start playing, and we would play basically once a month when we had all a free time slot for that. So it would all, of course, take quite a bit of arranging to be able to do this. One of the players who had been playing earlier didn't really want to get back into role playing anymore. He had moved a bit further out, so a good 40 minutes drive from where I live. And of course, we're still good friends, but he doesn't really have the time or doesn't make role playing a priority in his life anymore. But the rest of the group kept on playing, and then we made characters for Harn and started the current campaign that we're still playing in. So the campaign has been going on maybe around 5 years, and it's a bit different from the previous ones because it has not really concentrated on the island of Harn, but the characters are Vikings who actually come from Ivinia, north of Harn, which is kind of Scandinavian analog in the world. And they come from a very specific group of islands called Rogna, and the Kingdom of Rogna is famous for its piracy. So for the past 5 years they have been committing piracy all over the world and traveling not only around Harn and in Harn, but also south to the Venarian Sea, past the Venarian Sea towards Anzaloria, which is the equivalent or the Africa analog. So Harn has been really central in my return to role-playing games, but ever since I got back, I've also been looking at different other games, and I've seen a lot of games that really inspire me. One of the games which I got into quite recently was actually Conan, and this is the Modiphius Conan 2D20 version. where I looked at the Kickstarter quite greedily and wanted to get into it. At the time, didn't have the finances to do it to the extent that I wanted to, and maybe that's a good decision, because later on I've seen that the Kickstarter hasn't really been able to deliver everything on time, but it has been quite easy to purchase everything when it comes out. So after some attempts with my son, his friend, and friend's father, we created characters for Conan, and I started running a campaign for them maybe a year and a half ago, and they have been experiencing, the kids, their first steps in role playing through Conan and type of sword and sorcery, and it's been great fun. Not only do we get opportunities to see each other and have fun together, but also they can learn about role playing, what it is about, and get a bit of a different experience from playing PlayStation or playing different games on their phones. And one of the things that I like most about Conan is that the level of truthfulness to the writings of Robert E. Howard, how it has managed to capture the feeling of his short stories, and how it has stayed loyal to what he has written instead of trying to invent a lot of stories or characters, or come up with a whole number of different new ideas which maybe would not fit Robert E. Howard's vision of the Hyborian world. I think the mechanics support this kind of heroic role-playing super well, especially the idea of momentum and doom, which give these meta-currencies, which give the players lots of different opportunities to affect the course of the game, and also give the game master a chance to make for a different game. Those kinds of meta-currencies were not really familiar to me before Conan, and then they have become a bit more common to me since then. So this Conan game is something that's also going on in addition to the regular hard game that we have. Then of course there's lots of different games that I have been looking at. One of them being the Mongoose Traveler, which I think has been doing a great job of keeping up the stellar reputation of Traveler. Actually a game that I never have really experienced or tried playing or game mastering, but I think it's something that we will take a look at. I think one of the main drivers, one of the main inspirations here is the Pirates of Drinax campaign, which I think is a modern classic and deserves all the accolades that it's getting. And I think on the Mongoose part, they are doing a good job of keeping up the game line with steady products, publishing new things, and really making it viable and a living game line which you can enjoy and keep on playing. So Traveler is one thing that I'm interested in, and I will maybe cover it here at some point in more detail. I think there's lots of other interesting new games coming out, which I will also cover. One of these being Forbidden Lands, already has been out for some time and has received a lot of praise and accolades. It's really a different type of game from the ones that I'm currently enjoying, but you can see from the design and the amount of thought, amount of work that has been put into it, that the designers have really wanted to create a great game, have paid homage to older games and kind of the older role-playing game experience, but also have created something modern and something that it's nice to enjoy right now. So that's, I think, a comprehensive look of my role-playing game history. Maybe there were a couple of things that I left out, but I think you got the gist of the things that I've been enjoying and have been playing. And I think I will cover a lot of these, but also other stuff in future videos on this channel. So if you like this, give it a like and subscribe, and then I will see you with another episode next week.